Exactly. So it is now 2 minutes past, and I think we can get started. Welcome everyone to this session, to this user group today. Today we have a special guest star, Jon. You can present yourself in a few minutes, and I have a few slides to get started as used to. So my name is Brian. I'm your host for today. And today we will hear Jon talk about data write back to data warehouse in Fabric from Power BI. And I just heard a small cliffhanger there that you have extra problems when we come to Fabric. So let's see what happens. A few slides before we get started here. This session will be recorded. The recording has been started and will be made available on this LinkedIn group. I'll post that link in the chat as we go along, so you don't have to write it down. You'll get it in the chat directly. Usually I get a lot of LinkedIn messages and chats on this chat after the meeting saying that people can't download the video. That is by purpose, because we would like to edit out things that goes haywire, or also give the speaker an option to not publish this on YouTube afterwards if things go really down the drain. So that's why. If you joined through the Meetup channel, then please answer the feedback mail. We would love to get better and hear your ideas on how we can do that. So please give us input and feedback. We only get better to hear from you guys. That was it from me. I will hand it over to you, Jon, and then I'll stop sharing my screen. And then, Jon, if you can just present yourself. And for the record, to every attendee, Jon will do natural pauses, a few pauses in his speak to get questions and do the answers. So if you have any questions, please write them in the chat. I will moderate the chat, and if we get too many questions, I will appoint Jon to the questions that I think should be answered there. So don't hesitate to write a question. They will be answered no matter what. So I will stop sharing, and then it's up to you, Jon, to go ahead.
Thank you so much, Brian. I will share my screen here, and hopefully we get the PowerPoint slide here. I don't have a lot in terms of slides. I have an introduction slide, and that's almost it. But to get that out of the way, my name is Jon, and I'm super excited to get to talk to the user group today. I've been a listener for a while. Now it's great to be a speaker here for once. I'm a consultant at Inspire, a Danish-based company which was acquired half a year ago by Valentic, if some of you heard of that. But we're now an international consulting firm working on data projects, and my role is that I get to play around in the realm of Microsoft Fabric and Power Platform and specialize in the intersection between the two. And that's also luckily the topic of the session for today. The other fun little personal details on the slide, don't want to spend a lot of time on those, but you can expect that the session today will be almost purely live demo and showing you what it's all about. How do you actually do data write back to Microsoft Fabric? And with that, just a very brief agenda, what you can expect. We'll start out with a little bit of motivation, set the stage, why even bother with this topic. Some of you are probably familiar with it. Then we'll touch on the special challenge that is write back in Fabric as in contrast to write back to other data sources. And then we'll of course show you how to build the actual solution, how to overcome this challenge. And then I'll feed you a lot of details along the way, interesting side topics such as governance and security on this kind of solution, and we'll take that. But please feel free, as Brian said, write questions in the chat. I'll do a couple of catch-up pauses along the way to check in and see if there are any questions yet. And then also, of course, at the end, we'll do a sort of more free form Q&A for anybody interested. So that's what you can expect for the next 45-50 minutes or so. So to set the stage and sort of motivate the topic, I'd like to take you straight into a report in Power BI and actually show you what this is all about. So on screen here, hopefully you can see it, I have a Power BI report in a Microsoft Fabric enabled workspace. Super basic. The left-hand side is a regular Power BI report that just has Contoso demo data. I'm showing some sales data here by country, product, email in a drill down. And on the right-hand side is where all the fun stuff happens. And now there are a lot of things going on here. This is a report I use for multiple different speaker sessions. The one that we are mostly interested in is the middle one here. But just to set the stage, I thought I'd give you just a brief general introduction to the idea of extending Power BI reports with the rest of the Power Platform, that is Power Apps and Power Automate. And the primary reason for doing so is that you can really build custom extensions for Power BI, custom visualizations, custom extensions, custom interactivity by embedding Power Apps or Power BI, Power Automate into your Power BI reports. And so the most basic way of doing that, and I think what a lot of people have already adopted in some form in their reporting, not all, some have, is basic comment or annotation apps, most commonly seen in financial reporting, where you'd like the user of a Power BI report to provide some kind of input inside of a report. Usually that could be qualitative analysis on sales numbers, or it could be anything, right? And that kind of functionality is not built into Power BI. There is no way for users to provide any more input in a normal Power BI report than what they can do in a slicer selection, or potentially a parameter if you're toying with that, right? But we can build a pretty simple Power App in which we are able to add comment functionality. And that's sort of the first step, I think, for most people toying with building extensions for Power BI reports. It would be something like a comment app where the data that you are creating with the Power App is only also displayed in the same Power App. So in this case, I could drill down into some data in my report here, and I could add a comment for a data point that I select. So say I want to say that Carrie-Anne is, you see I already had an old comment there, but I could say Carrie-Anne's sales are high. And I could store that by pressing submit. This is all a Power App, and I'll show you in detail how that's built in a second. But now this data point has been stored and is mapped to that selected data point. And if I select something else, the Power App will not show that, or rather will show if there's any data for that specific data point. And now my report is a little slow, but if I drill up, you could see the example, hopefully. There's no comment stored here. It was only stored on that specific item of Carrie-Anne. You can see it again here. And that is a really, really cool kind of extension and pretty easy to build. This Power App that you see here is just building on a SharePoint list. It could also be a SQL database. And it's simple to make because the data is only referenced inside of this visual. The challenge, and where the topic of today's exercise comes into the picture, is when we want to do write back into our data warehouse or data backend in general and use this data somewhere else in our report that is not inside of the Power App. And the reason that's a little challenging is, of course, due to the timing and the refresh of the data, right? If I'm submitting some data to my backend, and I need to display that data live in my report, well, first of all, I need my semantic model in Power BI to use a live connection to the underlying data source, which is, well, with Fabric now a little easier, right? With Direct Lake and a little more accommodating, but previously it was only Direct Query, and we maybe wouldn't use that way too often. So that's one reason that's a little complex, and the other is that even though you have a live connection to the underlying data, you also need to perform a visual refresh of the report itself in order to display any new data in the report. But it is possible to do this, and I'd like to show you just a demonstration of the app that we're going to build together today, or at least we're not going to build it from scratch, but we're going to decipher the pre-cooked version. I'll show you all the steps that needs to be taken. This master data management app that I have here and how that works. So I've built another simple Power App here and embedded it into my Power BI report, in which the user is able to choose a dimension that they wish to change. In this case, you can see I've already toyed a little around with Caleb's email here. If I'd like to change Caleb's email, I can say I want to instead input Caleb's email at Gmail, Caleb's new email at gmail.com. I can save this data with my Power App. It'll just take a second. And then what we should see is once the visual refresh completes, Caleb's old email here turned into Caleb's new email. And now this data that I inputted in the Power App is not only shown in the Power App, it's actually in my native Power BI bar chart over on the left-hand side. And that is sort of the primary functionality that we want to decipher in the session today. How do you accomplish this? How do you build this into your reports? And just to sort of get your brain started with where is this functionality cool? Why would you want to do this, right? Here I'm providing one example, master data management. You could think of a scenario where this would be a way to maintain dimension tables or allow business users to provide additional dimensional attributes in a dimensional model. But I think it's maybe a little far-fetched to think that that would be best practice despite all of your best security efforts inside of the Power App. I think a more likely scenario for this, or a scenario where this could work very well, would be some kind of scenario forecasting, budget input exercises. Basically, anytime you have a Power BI where you are already using a SharePoint list or an Excel spreadsheet to let users feed data into your model, you could consider whether the user experience would be improved by having the input interface directly inside of your report, with your Power BI visualizations providing direct feedback to the users as they are providing their inputs. I at least think it's a very cool potential use case if we had a budget builder report in which we are able to put in potential budget values and compare them to historical sales values or what it might be, and let the user not be limited to a sort of parameter what if scenario forecasting type analysis, but perhaps being able to input more complex data in a Power App that feeds directly into the data model. So that's kind of the motivation behind this session and why you should care about it. We want to do data write back to our database so that we can use live inputted data as part of the rest of our visualizations. Whether it's dimensional data or facts that we are inputting, transactional data, all of that is of course possible. So that's the motivation. And now I guess the next step here is to talk a little bit about why is this extra challenging in Fabric than it usually is. And to do that, I think we should try to actually get started with building an app that looks like this one. So when you want to build your own Power App extensions to Power BI, what I recommend you do is actually not to use Power BI Desktop, but to use the web modeling experience. Of course, there are many reasons why you would maybe do this in desktop anyway, and you can definitely do it, but at least for the purpose of sort of quick iterative development like this, the development experience for embedding Power Apps in Power BI is much better on the web. And I'll show you in a second why that's the case. But to do so, let's just open edit mode for this report and add the native Power Apps for Power BI visualization. So no custom visuals needed for this at all, right? I can add a new visualization, and the way this visual works is just like any other Power BI visual. It won't display anything until I start adding data to my Power App. And that's also kind of the magic behind this integration, right? That my Power App here will automatically be filtered depending on what I've selected in my Power BI report. And that happens because I'm able to pull in data fields from my semantic model into the Power App itself. So in this case, I could, what fields have I added to this one? I can hit it here. I've added a couple of measures, region, country name, email address. I'll just add something here just to show the example, email address and total sales, and now the Teams window's in the way. Some customer information. Actually, region, country name was there. Let's say that's it. And you can see the window has now changed to say, well, I can choose an existing app or I can create a new one. Let's do that. So if I now go create a new app, it'll open the Power Apps, the Canvas Power Apps Designer interface, which I will not spend the whole session going through all of the different Power Apps capabilities here. That's not the point of the session, but I will show you more or less what you need to know in order to get started with building these integrations. The first thing you need to know about this interface is that Power Apps are built up of screens, a number of screens, which have a number of controls on them. And it's a very sort of drag and drop UI to create these Power Apps. It's very easy to get started, and anybody who works with Power BI would have a blast toying around with this tool. It's not super difficult to get started with. When you're working with Power Apps, you can add a number of data sources for inputting and outputting data. And the first thing to know when you're building Power Apps that you've created from inside of Power BI is that they will have this data element called Power BI integration. And this is the link that allows us to visualize data that's coming directly from our Power BI or Fabric semantic model inside of Power Apps. So you can see here, just by creating the app, it automatically created a screen for me and put a gallery in here so I can show some data. And it automatically populated my gallery with the data that's coming from Power BI integration.data. That's all fine and good. I can see the 3 fields that I inputted from Power BI, and these are also the fields that I will be able to filter my my Power App by, but I'll get back to that in a second. So that's one way to get data from Power BI into Power Apps is through this Power BI integration element here. But another way is that I can add an external data source. In the left-hand menu here, I can go to the data pane and I can add data. And from here, I can add data to, well, you know, just like you can in Power BI with Power Query, or you can connect to almost any data source here. Dataverse is what Microsoft is pushing a lot, but SQL Server is what most people are building their Power Apps on. And if you want to connect to Fabric, you can use the SQL Server connector as well and connect to the SQL endpoint of your Fabric lakehouses and warehouses. So let's try and do that. Let's try and input some data from a Fabric warehouse in this case and try to read that in here. So I'm going to add a new SQL Server connection. I actually already have a few here. And I'll need to provide it with a server name and a database name. The way you get this from your Fabric environment is that now I have a second page here. If you go to your Fabric warehouse or lakehouse and open that, and you go into the settings that you'll find in the top left corner, you'll find this SQL connection string. Oh, didn't manage to get that. The Teams window was in the way, but the SQL connection string here, if you copy that and use that as the SQL Server name here, and as database name, you'll need to spell out exactly the name of your warehouse or lakehouse, and then you'll be able to connect to that and actually pick all the tables that you want. So I could take here the dim customer, dim employee, dim store, whatever I wanted, and add those as data sources to my Power App. Connect to those, and it'll add those. And I can now, I could copy paste this gallery, and instead of using the Power BI integration.data, I could now reference dim customer, and now my fields will break. I actually understood that there was a field called email address. I could reference any other field that wasn't dim customer. I could get, let's get the last name instead. Or maybe let's get both first name and last name, this item dot first name, and this item dot last name. Oh, missed the name %. And that's kind of the idea of how do you build Power Apps. You insert controls on the screen, you point them to a data source or provide them with an action, and you reference it with this language called PowerFX. And there are lots of tutorials online that will show you a little more how to get started. Today I'll show you exactly how that first app that I built for you was built. But here now we managed to connect to dim customer, and this is data in our Fabric data warehouse. I'm now live in my Power App referencing data from my Fabric warehouse using the SQL endpoint. And the next logical step here is then, well, okay, if I'm able to input data from my Fabric warehouse, well, can I then also output data to my Fabric warehouse? Because usually if you're building Power Apps using the SQL Server connection here, you can patch data, you can update or create or delete or anything you want in the destination SQL Server, just as well as you can input from it. But there is a little bit of a problem when we do that with Fabric, and to show you that challenge, I'll actually just open up the app in question. Let me just save this actually just for good measure. User group demo. Save that, and save that. Now you'll see this little app that I built will come in here, and the reason doing so, That's important. It'll just take a second. Instead, let's open that other app that I talked about. If you want to open an existing app, you'll just click on the little 3 dots here. You'll click Edit, and it will open up the app in a new window. Here we go. It's just a little faster to show you this way why the write back to Fabric is a little more difficult in the app by using something pre-built here. I can cheat a little here and show you how it actually works. So I already defined some code here. I'll run through it in a second in more detail. But if I delete this, if you try to submit data to a Fabric data source, you'll get this error message that says that the data source is either read-only or has no primary key, so the function patch can't write to it. And the reason that you will receive this error message if you try to write data to a Fabric data source from Power Apps is, well, there are 2 different potential reasons you might run into this. One is if you're using Data Lakehouse as the source here, because the SQL connection, the SQL endpoint of Lakehouses in Fabric are read-only. So that's why it says, well, that's one of the reasons why this error message might appear. But even if you're using a warehouse so that the read-only is not relevant anymore, as you can indeed write to warehouse endpoints, the trouble is that we cannot enforce primary keys on our warehouse. We can create primary keys, but we cannot enforce them. And for some reason, that's a limitation in Power Apps that we can't do that. And of course, there is a workaround for that I'll get back to in just a second. I just wanted to get you up to speed with how is this app then in general built. And the way that you can see here, it's just 10 controls. I have 10 different things on my screen here that sort of to build a little on top of what we did before. All I've done in this app that I have shown you how it works here is that I've colored my background green. I've added in 4 different labels where I've just put in the text that needs to be there. Then I've added a control where I've a drop-down control where I've manually defined which options should the user be able to choose. Then I've put in a text input, or rather it could just as well have been a label, in which I, depending on what value the user has chosen in the drop-down, I'm switching over that value, and then I'm returning a value coming from that Power BI integration.data data source that I've selected. So if the user toggles between the email to the product name, it'll show the product name in this old value label here. If they choose email, it'll go back to email. Then there's a new value text input in which there's nothing there. I've just put a text input in there, and then I've put a hint text to allow the user to know that this is where they should input their new value. And then all of the magic happens in this button that I was just showing you before, in which I am first saving a couple of variables that I want to store in memory because I'm going to use them in a second. And that is, first I'm saving information about which table in the destination do I want to submit my data to, which column do I want to submit my data to, what's the old value to be overwritten, and what's the new value to overwrite the old value with. And then what we do to overcome that limitation that we saw down here is that instead of using the Power App native patch function, we're going to call a Power Automate flow instead. Because with Power Automate, we can run raw SQL commands against any SQL server, just like you could with SQL Server Management Studio or anything else. And if you've toyed a little around with the SQL connection, with the SQL endpoints of data warehouses in Fabric, you'll know that you can easily just throw almost any T-SQL command at it, and it'll accept it with some limitations, of course, right? But we can invoke that sort of capability with Power Automate, and that's what I'll show you in a second. But what you need to know is that my button here, all it does is it takes the information that the user has selected here, stores that in 4 different variables, and then it sends those 4 variables into my Power Automate flow called Fabric Writeback. And I'll show you how that one looks. Actually, before I show that, are there any questions in the chat at this point, Brian?
Yes, you have one question. Can you connect forms to Power App and then to Power BI?
Good question. You cannot connect a Power App directly to forms, but you can have your form connect to well, you can look at the underlying data for a form, or you can store the form data in a SharePoint list from which you can read the data from Power Apps. That would be the easiest way to do that if you want to use forms data inside of Power Apps. Yeah.
Great. And that was a question from Rahul Yain. I'm sorry for the pronunciation here. If that is sufficient, then I hope that is. If it's not, then please write a question again in the chat. Thank you.
We can definitely take a deeper discussion on sort of good Power Apps sources for building extensions at the end of the session. That's definitely an interesting topic.
Thank you.
All right, so just to continue here, we've now established that creating the Power App is super simple. We're putting in a few labels, a few interactive controls, and then one button which stores 4 variables in memory using a CTE, a width formula it's called in Power Apps. And then we are triggering a Power Automate flow that I have right here called Fabric Writeback. And now out here in the left-hand side menu, I can go to the Power Automate tab and I can open up that, and I'll just show you how simple that Power Automate flow is also. Just always takes a second to load here. So it works. And this is only necessary because of that lack of enforced primary keys in Power Apps. Any other SQL database data source you can write to natively from Power Apps without doing this extra step. But this, what you see on screen right here, that's the extra step that you need to do data write-back in Microsoft Fabric. So what I have here, super simple 3-action Power Automate flow. For those of you who don't know a lot about Power Automate, it's a flow builder that allows you to automate certain processes. Automate flows can be triggered by all sort of means. You can have event-driven triggered flows. You can have scheduled flows that runs every day at a specified time. And then what we're doing here is using an instant flow, a flow that's triggered when a button is pressed. And that could either be that you press a button in Power Automate, but it could also be that you press a button in Power Apps. And that's what we do here. So when a button is in Power Apps is being pressed, I'm saying, okay, I want this flow to be able to accept 4 different variables. And you guessed it, those are the 4 variables that we defined on the button just before. Then we're going to use a second action here that is execute a SQL query. That's one of the many actions that you can use in Power Automate. And we're going to point that to my Fabric server name, the same one that I copied before when I inputted to Power Apps. You can use the same one. And then for the database name here, back when I created this demo, messed up and accidentally used the data flow staging warehouse. You shouldn't do that. I should probably be using the Contoso warehouse here. Doesn't matter for the sake of the demo, but what you should see is just that I'm writing my SQL statement here using the dynamic variables that was defined in my input. So I'm simply using an update statement here. This is super plain and simple SQL. Update the table to right and set the where the column name is equal to new value, where the column name is equal to old value. Those 4 variables were just the ones we defined before. Then there's an optional step here of sending a response back to the Power App. That's actually not necessary, but you can do this to improve error handling in your flows. I could have 2 different branches here, one depending on whether this succeeded and one if it fails, and return a different outcome to the Power App to allow me to actually build in functionality to alert my user if the write-back operation somehow failed. I haven't built that into the demo here, even though I have I am actually sending a response here, but the smart user will see that in this case, I'm sending a success message no matter what happens, which is not best practice, but you can do error handling like that. But this whole flow, this is being triggered. If you go into your button here, you can see that I am, let me just comment this out again. I'm invoking this Power Automate flow with the Fabric writeback.run command here, the formula. You just put the name of the Power Automate flow.run, and then I'm feeding it those 4 variables in the correct order. You need to do that in the exact order that you've created them inside of Power Automate. So text needs to be the first of the variables that that Power Automate expects. So I've listed all those 4. And when I click the button, it'll first initialize all of the variables. It'll run this and then it'll save the result in a variable that I've defined here. But this step is really optional. That's only if you want to do the error handling part. So that's what actually does all the magic. When you select a dimension here, it will automatically change which table and column I'm looking at. And then depending on the old value and new value, my update statement will sort of do a pinpoint update statement on the SQL endpoint, the write-enabled endpoint of the Fabric warehouse. The last piece of the puzzle here is, how do you take this functionality and make it truly live? Because I in the beginning, when I was talking about this in solution, I said that, well, it's only one part of the puzzle to actually get the data into the backend and have a report with a live connection. There's also the hurdle of performing a visual refresh. And it's not very ideal for the user to have to click this button and then go refresh either with a visual refresh, or for those who don't even know this button exists, maybe they'll refresh the entire page. Not a great user experience. But luckily for us, the Power BI integration element that we see here has another function that we can call Power BI integration.refresh, which forces the Power BI report in which the Power App is embedded to perform a visual refresh. So on purpose, I had not scrolled all the way down on this formula, because you would have been able to see all the fun bits, right? But this super simple little formula is what actually does half the job in this case. It forces a visual refresh to happen after the rest of the formula up here has been performed. And formulas in Power Apps, they are sequential. So this one will only run after the Power Automate flow has finished running. And then you'll notice that in this case, I've also done a little bit of flair, right? In the sense that I'm showing that spinning GIF that you saw during the demo. I'm showing that and hiding it again when I'm finished, just to provide a little more interactivity for the end user. And the end product is exactly as we saw earlier. Now I'm having a little bit of a visual bug here due to what I created earlier. But I could go ahead again and change Caleb's email once more. He's a little tired of his email. So that's Caleb's email. He got a new one. I can save that. Now you know what's happening underneath the scenes. When I click the button, it stores all of the variables, triggers a Power Automate flow, performs a visual refresh, and Caleb's email is now displayed live in our report. So just to sort of recap those technical prerequisites and what do you need to do in order to perform the actual write back here. You need to use a Fabric warehouse and not a lakehouse, because the lakehouse SQL endpoint is read-only and the warehouse endpoint is both read and write. So that's prerequisite number one. And number two is, you need to not only use Power Apps, you need to be willing to accept adding Power Automate to your solution architecture, because Power Apps natively is unable to write to destinations without enforced primary keys, and Fabric does not accommodate that. And I don't think it's on the roadmap at all either. I'm unsure, maybe somebody can confirm that, but I haven't seen it anywhere myself. I think it's more likely that Power Apps sometime in the future might be able to run a simple update statement like we saw us doing in Power Automate here, than it is to see the enforced primary keys. So those are sort of the primary prerequisites to overcoming what is usually a pretty simple exercise. To just give you the idea here, right? All of this, what I'm doing in the button here, this whole formula with the with formula, all of this, if I could hit the button, could be replaced by this line of code if I was using a SQL server and not a Fabric data warehouse. This line of code would be sufficient if it wasn't for Fabric. And that's what has a lot of people puzzled about data writeback. I think a lot of people have started using writeback in Power BI with Power Apps when their data foundation is in a regular SQL database somewhere. But for Fabric, I have not seen a lot of people venture this road yet. And hopefully that's something we'll see change. I think this is the next good time to see if there are any questions before I return to security topics and stuff like that. If there is anything, Brian.
There is actually one, and I think it's a good one from Alberto, about licenses and cost. What do you need for this?
Great question. So if you've noticed, when I added this SQL connector, it has a flag here that says it's a premium connector. And that means that any user who needs to access and use this Power App will need a Power Apps premium license. And that means it's a licensing that goes beyond the Fabric and Power BI licensing. So one thing is, of course, you'll need access to a Fabric enabled, or at least if you're doing write back to Fabric, you'll need access to a Fabric enabled workspace. So first you need to get the Fabric and Power BI licensing sorted, right? And in this case, it's enough to be a consumer of the report, right? So if you're using a premium capacity with Fabric enabled, a regular free user could actually go ahead and consume the Power BI report. But in order to use the Power App that's embedded, each user will need a personal Power Apps premium license, or you could license the Power App with a premium per app license, but that's a little rare nowadays. I'm not even sure if they sell that kind of license any longer. But the important takeaway is that you need to license every user of the Power App with a Power Apps premium license, and or rather. Actually, I'm saying this the other way around. Because we are not using the SQL Server connection in Power Apps, it's actually not a Power Apps license that you need. You need a Power Automate premium license. Excuse me for the confusion there. You could consider, I think it's a valid question whether you could get away with just using a service account for the Power Automate flow. But I would argue that you need to read carefully in the terms and conditions whether that's allowed or not. I would always recommend a personal Power Automate premium scheme for this.
Yeah, and if I may, just to follow up on that, so to get a Power BI premium license, you either need to buy the license for $10 per month as an addition to your Office license, or be on at least the E5 license terms in Office. Then with the E5, you get the Power BI, the Power Apps built in to the license for that.
That is also true.
And there is a second question from Rahul here. He's sorry that he's new to Microsoft, but Rahul, don't be sorry. There is no need to apologize here.
No.
Every question is quite feasible to ask. What's the language you use to code in the Power App? Oh, good question.
Yeah, good question. The language is called PowerFX, and I think to most people it feels like you're working. It feels more like you're working with Excel, with VBA, than anything else. In structure and in format, it's a very sort of declarative language where you just reference specific items, and you have very specified functions that you can't really extend yourself. You can't import a lot of packages like you can in Python. It is a little limited in what it can do, but or rather, I would say that it's not very limited. You can do a lot of things, but it's not a full coding language. It's more akin to learning VBA or formulas in Excel than anything else. So PowerFX, if you're curious and want to look up more about that. And I'd recommend anybody who's looking to get started with Power Apps in general to simply jump on Microsoft Learn and have a crack at some of their excellent learning material for getting started with Power Apps. They also run these app in a day workshops that you can enroll in, and there are plenty of consultancies in Denmark who'll have similar courses that you can also ask your employer to inquire about if that's your thing.
And I'm almost reluctant to say that, and I know this word is now no longer valid to say, but I'll say it anyway. If you know your way around Microsoft Access, then this is quite easy to adopt into. So.
Yeah, and I think the use case for Power Apps in general is if you are still dabbling in old Access solutions or Excel spreadsheets or SharePoint lists as input for some kind of business intelligence product, especially if it's a Power BI or Fabric solution, you should consider whether you could get that up to speed with a more modern tool like Power Apps in combination perhaps with Power Automate and make your life easier, definitely.
Indeed, yes.
All right. Let's just, I have a few more sort of small comments, tidbits that I wanted to show before just going full Q&A style. Just a few notes on security in all of this. I mean, back when Fabric was first released, I think there was a lot of people who talked about one security and all of that. That's almost, a forbidden word these days. I don't think anybody is mentioning that recently. I think it's a long way until we see that. And unfortunately, the sort of security aspect of creating these solutions are a little complex as well, right? Because really what you need to think about in this case is you need to govern access to the report itself in which the Power Apps are living. Then you need to govern access to the Power App itself and the embedded Power Automate flow. And then you also need to govern access to the destination Fabric data warehouse that you are working with here. So for this to work and in order for you to limit who is able to perform write back directly to your beloved Fabric data warehouse, you'll need to put in security restrictions directly on your workspaces on some level on your warehouse, on your Power App and your Power Automate flow. It's important to mention that the warehouse specifically as an object needs to be taken care of on its own. It's not enough for you. It is enough for you to block access to the Power App if you don't want people to use it in general. But there are definitely scenarios where you'll want input apps like this to have sort of separate access rights depending on who is accessing the Power App. And to do this the right way, you'll need to control access on the specific tables inside of your warehouse, depending on who is accessing it. When they are using Power Automate to access the underlying flow, it will pass on the user credentials of the user using the app itself. So that's just something for you to think about, that there are a lot of touch points here where you'll need to think about who has access to what, especially when those apps start becoming more complex and potentially have different levels of access depending on who's accessing it. So there is definitely added complexity on the governance side of things if you decide to do this. And that's maybe also why I, to some extent, have regretted that my initial demo here says that it's a master data management app, because in reality, I'd probably discourage most people from using this as a master data management app. I think it is a much better use case to use this for budget forecasting scenarios where you can say, the input here, they are just maybe iterative budget numbers that are fixed somewhere else, and it's more of a playground solution or something like that. I definitely think that you should take security very seriously when you are working with these solutions. The last thing that I wanted to show is just to fully complete the rabbit hole right here, right? So in this case, we have a Power Automate flow embedded in a Power App, embedded in a Power BI report. And I think what takes this to the next level is if I jump back to PowerPoint here and jump a few slides ahead. Oh, I went once too far. You can embed this whole animal inside of PowerPoint as well using the Power BI add-in for PowerPoint. So what you're looking at right here is a live version of my Power BI report from before. It's fully interactive. I'm logged in with my own credentials, and now it's a little slow, probably because I didn't refresh this in ages. But the whole app is fully interactive, and the embedded Power Apps and Power Automate flows, they work here as well. I think in general, people are severely underutilizing the embedding of Power BI and PowerPoint. I think there's still a lot of executives out there who are receiving weekly PowerPoints with updated numbers. If they can't find their way into the Power BI portal, give them a PowerPoint, but embed the Power BI report, right? That's awesome still. But the fact that you can do write back from PowerPoint directly to your Fabric data warehouse, I think that's pretty crazy. Just to document that this actually does work, let me just change Caleb's email once again. Caleb's new email at gmail.com. It works just like it does in the browser. And then small teaser, I don't know, you might see that there are other things in this report we haven't touched on. If you want to go the extra mile with extensions for Power BI reports using Power Automate and using Power Apps, you can build your own ChatGPT extension for Power BI if you're not happy with what the Copilot is giving you. Oh, I accidentally scrolled there, because scrolling apparently doesn't work so well in PowerPoint. You can put in other instant triggered Power Automate flows if that's what you want. I've used that sometimes to give end users the power to refresh data sets using the Power BI API. Also I have another session where I talk about creating data-driven alerts with Power Automate. This one triggers a Teams message that summarizes sales numbers that are low or something like that. But that's just more food for thought if you are thinking about dabbling in how can you leverage the whole Power Platform together with your Fabric and Power BI solution, and not only thinking about write back, but also thinking about data-driven notifications, other extensions. And then if we think Office and Microsoft 365, embedding this whole shebang in a PowerPoint, I think that's taking this to the next level. So I think that was actually what I had in terms of presentation. So I'd like to just open the floor for any and all questions you might have about this topic. I'm not sure if there is anything in the chat already, Brian.
No, there's not anything in the chat, but I would actually say I was really blown away with the inception part, the last part here, where you more or less inject your layers on layers on layers inside Power BI. I love it.
and one might ask, is this a good solution? I'm not sure, to be honest, but this, as far as I'm concerned, I think this is the only way that you can add Power Automate and Power Apps to your PowerPoint right now, is to do it through Power BI like this. Yes. So if you for some reason wish to make your PowerPoint more interactive, you could just make a shell of a Power BI report and embed just a full Power App inside of it, if that's what you wanted to do. Yeah. I'm not sure why you would, but you could.
Yeah, sure. Great. A question from my own mind here. I know that we don't have time to touch upon the details around the ChatGPT thing here, but just to make sure that the attendees know that the ChatGPT, you also need some sort of licenses or cost attribution or something around that to make that work, right?
Sure. In this case, I have a pay-as-you-go subscription to OpenAI, to ChatGPT. I don't have a premium plan. I'm just paying. I think I've put $10 in to my OpenAI account, and it's just feeding off of that. Not very expensive to do if you're just toying around with it. If you're in an enterprise setting, I'd recommend you to, well, at least if you're in a large enterprise, chances are somebody in your organization is working on your own GPT models, right? And there's nothing stopping you from creating an integration to an Azure-driven OpenAI model that is also using company data and all kinds of stuff. So you could think about potentially embedding your company GPT as a chatbot inside of your Power BI reports. And then, of course, still, as you say, there's probably a cost involved with that somewhere down the line, right? But sure, yeah.
Yeah, great. Okay, do you have anything else in slide? Because the chat does not have more questions. And please, if any of your attendees have any questions, then within a few minutes, if we don't have anything, we will close the meeting and the chat. So please write them in the chat now, because we are on the verge of ending this meeting.
The only thing that I myself would like to just add is this topic is dear to me, especially this intersection between Fabric and the Power Platform. I think we too often talk about them as separate entities. They are separate entities, but there's a lot of good interactivity between the two. I blog a lot about this on LinkedIn, and I recently started my own blog as well. I somehow forgot to put the link in here, but find me on LinkedIn if you're curious about the topic. I share a lot of stuff on there, also about all the things that I teased here about GPT integrations and about data-driven alerts and all that kind of stuff. I think I may already have uploaded the slides here to GitHub. Otherwise, I will do it as well. So if you are curious about the very limited slides that I have here, they will be available to you as well.
Great. A small ask, Jon, could you please copy all your links that you just showed from the slide and then put them in the chat so people can get them?
I'll do that right away. Let's get them here.
Just a raw copy paste.
Yeah. There we go. And my blog as well is found here. All right.
Yeah, but also the you showed us all the links you have.
The articles, they are here. There you go.
Thank you. Great.
Perfect.
And now you get all the superb session, and you get I also saw where is that? Thanks for a nice session from Christian Holm. And so, yeah, it's great.
Thank you for...
I don't see any more questions. And so I would like to say thank you, Jon, for your attendance and your presentation. I really learned something new here around Inception and how I can embed Power Apps and Power Flow and Power whatever Power Platform I have inside both my Power BI and also my PowerPoint. A lot of power words there. Sorry.
Yes.
Thank you, Jon, for your time, and thank you for all the attendees. And I hope to see you soon again.
Thank you for all the great questions, guys, and thanks for listening in.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.